On September 29, 1982, the family of 27-year-old Adam Janus was gathered at his suburban Chicago home mourning his sudden and mysterious death. Earlier that day, Adam had woken up feeling a little under the weather and decided to call into work sick. Nothing alarming though, just your average cold symptoms. But then, at around lunchtime, Adam suddenly becomes dizzy and weak. Within moments, he's staggering into the kitchen, clutching at the counter, his wife watching in horror as he collapses to the floor. Adam is rushed to the hospital, where a medical team works frantically, trying everything in their power to revive him, but nothing seems to work. By mid-afternoon, Adam Janus is pronounced dead. The cause? A complete mystery, with no clear signs pointing to a specific ailment. The doctors tentatively label it as cardiac arrest, but in truth, they had no idea what so unceremoniously ended this young man's life. His grieving family was left in disbelief and gathered at Adam's home to support each other in their mourning. But little did they know that the day's horrors were far from over. Without warning, Adam's brother Stanley collapses to the floor, white foam seeping from his mouth as his body convulses. Chaos erupts as the family panics, dialing 911 in a desperate plea for help. The paramedics arrive quickly and immediately begin treating Stanley, but in the midst of their efforts, his wife Teresa starts showing the same symptoms and collapses as well. It's absolute chaos. 8 paramedics, 4 for each patient, are on site, frantically working to stabilize both Stanley and Teresa. Sirens wail as the ambulance speeds them to the hospital, where medical staff stood ready for what they now suspect might be a contagious illness. But this suspicion would prove to be inaccurate, as they would later find out that Stanley and Teresa had not had any contact with Adam that day, nor had they shown any symptoms of the illness before suddenly collapsing. The truth would turn out to be far more insidious than they could ever have imagined. That evening, Stanley was pronounced dead. Meanwhile, Teresa was in critical condition, fighting for her life, only to die soon after her husband. They needed to find out what had killed these people and fast, before more innocent lives were potentially lost. The local district fire department immediately called Nurse Helen Jensen, who was at her home nearby eating dinner. There's something going on here. We had a death this morning, and now we've brought in 2 more from the same house. They want a public health person here, and you're the only one I know. Jensen didn't waste a moment. She grabbed her things and headed straight to the Janus home to investigate. At first, everything seemed normal. The house looked just like any other suburban home. No signs of foul play, no obvious toxins, nothing that even so much as whispered danger. But Nurse Jensen knew something wasn't right. A string of deaths like this doesn't just happen by chance. Something was linking them together. But what?
Tylenol.
Huh?
I need Tylenol, bro. My head's killing me.
Oh, yeah. I've got a new bottle right here.
Thanks. You call this childproof? I'm an adult, for crying out loud.
Nurse Jensen's experience told her these rapid, fatal collapses must have been caused by ingesting something fast-acting. She began to methodically comb through the house, checking cabinets and drawers, searching for any clues. Her search revealed a variety of medications, over-the-counter drugs, prescription bottles, the usual mix found in most homes. But then, as she was about to give up, her eyes landed on something. A bottle of Tylenol.
Huh? Oh, haha! Oh, come on! A safety seal? Are they serious? What's next? A retinal scan?
It's there for a reason, Grill.
Yeah, to drive me nuts. It's just a headache pill, bro. What's the big deal?
How about the lives of countless innocent people? Is that a big enough deal for you?
What? Okay, yeah, obviously. But how?
Well, listen to the rest of this case and find out. At first, when Nurse Jensen saw the Tylenol bottle at the Janus home, it seemed utterly ordinary, a typical household item. But something was off. The bottle was new and, oddly enough, 6 capsules were missing, the exact number that would account for the 3 victims. A chill runs down Nurse Jensen's spine. What was going on here, and how far did it go? Meanwhile, in a small, crowded room back at the hospital, the air was thick with frustration. Doctors, police, and investigators sit around a table, poring over every detail. A chain of evidence is essential, but there was nothing. No trail to follow, no obvious culprit to pin the blame on. Investigator Nick Pichos with the Cook County Medical Examiner's office sits apart, his notepad blank. He scoured every inch of the Janus house, the attic, the basement, every corner, in a desperate hunt for clues. But he's come up empty-handed. A sharp knock at the door, and all eyes turn as Nurse Jensen steps into the room wearing an expression of determination and certainty. This, she plops an object onto the table, This is the cause.
Tylenol?
Yup. Investigator Pichos sat with his head in his hands, racking his brain for clues that could crack the case. His instincts told him it couldn't just be Tylenol, or if it was, there was something deeply sinister about it. Something as common and harmless as one dose of this medicine couldn't possibly kill these people, but tampering was still a consideration. After all, over-the-counter medicines didn't have protective seals back in 1982. Then, something clicked. Earlier that day, Pichos had heard about the mysterious death of Mary Kellerman. That morning, Mary Kellerman, a 12-year-old girl in a different suburb of Chicago, woke up to a runny nose and slight soreness in her throat. When Mary mentioned her symptoms to her parents, they decided that even though it was a school day, she wasn't in any shape to go. So, they gave her some medicine and told her to stay in bed and rest. But the Kellermans had no idea what tragic series of events had just been set in motion until later that morning, when Mary's father, Dennis, heard a strange noise after his daughter went to the bathroom. I heard the door close. Then I heard something drop. I went to the bathroom door. I called, "Mary, are you okay?" There was no answer. I called again, "Mary, are you okay?" There was still no answer. So I opened the door, and my little girl was on the floor unconscious. She was still in her pajamas. And just a few hours later, Mary Kellerman's parents found themselves at the hospital, signing their daughter's death certificate.
What is going on? People don't just suddenly drop dead from a sore throat.
Not typically, no. The official cause of death was unknown. But then, when investigator Pichos called the Elk Grove Village Police Department and asked about the medications paramedics had inventoried from the Kellerman home, to his astonishment, Tylenol was on the list. And so, Pichos immediately requested the bottle be brought to Northwest Community Hospital.
But how could Tylenol kill 4 people on the same day? That little girl wasn't even in the same neighborhood as the Janus family.
Well, that's the real question, isn't it? Except, there were actually a total of 7 victims who died that day. So let's take a closer look at the other 3 cases: Mary McFarland, Mary Reiner, and Paula Prince. Mary McFarland was working at an Illinois Bell store in Elmhurst. It was late in the day, and Mary was battling a nagging headache. Like most people, she turned to something familiar: extra-strength Tylenol. She stepped into the break room, popped a capsule or 2, and went back to her duties, hoping the headache would soon fade. But within minutes, Mary collapsed. Her coworkers, startled by the sudden turn of events, rushed to her side. Panic swept through the office as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Someone quickly called for medical assistance, and Mary was rushed to the hospital. But despite the efforts of medical professionals, it was already too late. Then there's Mary Reiner. She was just 27, a mother of 4, and had recently given birth to her youngest. Now, childbirth isn't easy, but Mary was still recovering when she started feeling unwell. Seeking some relief, she did what many of us would. She grabbed a bottle of Tylenol, unaware it would be the last decision she'd ever make. Moments after taking the capsules, Mary collapsed. Her husband, Ed, found her unresponsive and called for help. She was rushed to the hospital, but again, there was nothing they could do. Paula Prince was a flight attendant for United Airlines, someone accustomed to long, demanding hours. After finishing a flight, she made a routine stop at a Walgreens in Chicago to pick up a bottle of Tylenol. Interestingly, security footage from the store would later become a key piece of evidence, capturing Paula just moments before she purchased the capsules, the last recorded moments of her life. That evening, she returned to her apartment. Likely fatigued from her day, she took a couple of pills from the bottle to relax. It wasn't until the following day that she was discovered, unresponsive, with the Tylenol bottle conspicuously left on her counter. What makes these cases so unsettling is how random they were. None of these victims knew each other. They didn't shop at the same stores or live in the same neighborhoods. Once investigator Pichos held the 2 bottles of Tylenol in his hands, one from the Janus house and one from the Kellermans, he noticed a critical detail. He called the medical examiner and said, "Look, everything here is different except this. Both have Tylenol bottles, and they both have the same control number, MC2880.
So what? A bad batch?
That would be the first guess, but it didn't explain the speed and nature of these deaths. Only a severe toxin could kill so quickly. The medical examiner then asked Pichos to smell the capsules, so he uncapped the first bottle and took a sniff. A faint but familiar odor wafted out. Curious, he opened the second bottle and found the same smell lingering on the capsules. Almonds.
All these people were allergic to almonds?
No, Grill, but there is something that is universally deadly to all people that smells a lot like almonds. When Pichot shared this observation with the medical examiner, they immediately uttered the same word: cyanide.
What? Why would there be cyanide in Tylenol?
Before they could figure that out, they still had to confirm its presence. Blood samples from the victims were sent to the lab immediately, though the results wouldn't arrive until the next afternoon. When the results came in, they horrified everyone. Police, investigators, even seasoned doctors. The cyanide levels in the victim's blood were 100 to 1,000 times the lethal dose. Cyanide is one of the most potent killers, a chemical asphyxiant that prevents cells from using oxygen. Even trace amounts can be fatal. The way it works is by blocking oxygen from being absorbed by red blood cells, causing rapid asphyxiation. It's like a power outage for your body. Your cells are powered by mitochondria, which convert oxygen into energy. It blocks an enzyme, which is a key player in this process. No energy means your cells, especially your brain and heart, start dying fast. That's why cyanide poisoning hits like a freight train, quick and deadly. The scariest part? Cyanide is hard to detect, colorless, often odorless, since 20 to 40% of the population does not carry the gene needed to detect the odor of cyanide.
But wait, if the people who died were from all parts of town, then doesn't that mean that there could be tainted Tylenol everywhere? Like, what if there were other people out there just popping poison pills as they speak?
Exactly. Authorities found several more tainted bottles still sitting on Chicago store shelves, unsold. But the fear was there could be more. They needed to get Tylenol out of the public's hands and fast. The very next day, public health officials and Johnson & Johnson, the makers of the drug, issued an urgent warning: stop taking Tylenol. Shelves were cleared, and police patrolled the streets with sirens blaring, warning citizens to avoid Tylenol at all costs. The FDA got involved, and Chicagoans were in full panic mode. But here's where Johnson & Johnson's response became legendary. They managed the crisis in a way that's still commended to this day. They revolutionized product safety by introducing tamper-proof packaging seals, blister packs, and more. The company collaborated with all involved agencies, immediately halting advertisements and working alongside authorities to alert the public. They recalled all capsule versions of their product, a move that cost Johnson & Johnson a $100 million before-tax write-off. Their market share plummeted from 38% to just 8%. And yet, they remained committed to doing the right thing. Within days, the company pulled over 31 million bottles from store shelves, the first mass recall in American history. And when Tylenol returned to the market in new, triple-sealed containers, they had already launched a massive public relations campaign to regain public trust. And, remarkably, they succeeded. This recall wasn't just an operational feat. It became a pivotal moment in corporate crisis management, often studied in business schools as a textbook example of ethical responsibility over profit.
Yeah, a massive corporation did the right thing for the first time ever. But how did the cyanide get in the capsules in the first place? And how do we know that someone at Johnson & Johnson didn't do it, huh? Maybe they were so quick to act because it was their own mess that they were cleaning up.
Now that's the golden question. Who tampered with those bottles, left a trail of death across Chicago, and seemingly vanished without a trace? After investigators confirmed cyanide-laced Tylenol as the cause of the 7 deaths, the next challenge was figuring out how the tampering happened. Was it sabotage during production? A targeted attack on specific stores? The truth turned out to be disturbingly simple. On October 6th, one phone call sent ripples through the investigation. A bar owner had reached out to the Chicago police with a rather unusual tip. Apparently, a man named Roger Arnold had been in their bar, boasting about having cyanide at his home. And not just any cyanide, potassium cyanide, the exact kind used in the Tylenol murders. Now, Roger Arnold wasn't your average Joe. He had a peculiar mix of traits that immediately piqued investigators' interest. For one, he fancied himself a bit of a home chemist, dabbling in amateur experiments, the kind you wouldn't want your neighbor doing. On top of that, he worked as a dockhand for Jewel food stores. This was a critical detail because Jewel happened to be one of the retailers where 2 of the poisoned bottles were sold. One to Mary Kellerman's family, the other to the Janus family. Convenient, don't you think? So, the bar owner gave police a heads up, essentially saying, you might want to keep an eye on this guy. Turns out, Roger's life was in the middle of unraveling. He was going through a rough divorce, drinking heavily, and, by all accounts, not in the best state of mind. To the police, this tip seemed promising. They hit up the Lincoln Avenue bar scene, asking bartenders to notify them if Roger showed up. Days later, Roger strolled into a bar called Lily's, and the police wasted no time in picking him up. When questioned, Roger didn't exactly shy away from admitting some unsettling details. He confessed to ordering cyanide through a mail-order company out of Wisconsin earlier that summer. His reasoning? A home project. As if that wasn't eyebrow-raising enough, he claimed he'd gotten rid of it because it made his now ex-wife nervous. But despite all of this, Roger firmly denied being the Tylenol killer. Still, he allowed detectives to search his house, and what they found only strengthened their suspicions. The place was a chemistry enthusiast's dream, or nightmare, depending on your perspective. Beakers, vials, and manuals on poison making littered the place. One book in particular stood out: The Poor Man's James Bond, a DIY guide to all sorts of brewing dangerous concoctions. Add an arsenal of firearms and you've got a pretty concerning setup, but no cyanide, not a trace. And then there were the coincidences, if you believe in those, such as Roger frequenting areas near the stores where tainted bottles were purchased. And on the very same day the tip about Roger Arnold came in, Johnson & Johnson received an extortion letter, which read like something right out of a comic book villain's playbook. Gentlemen, as you can see, it is easy to place cyanide, both potassium and sodium, into capsules sitting on store shelves. And since the cyanide is inside the gelatin, it is easy to get buyers to swallow the bitter pill. Another beauty is that cyanide operates quickly. It takes so very little, and there will be no time to take countermeasures. If you don't mind the publicity of these little capsules, then do nothing. The letter demanded a cool $1 million wired to a specific bank account to stop the killings. And soon after, similar letters were sent to the Chicago Tribune and even President Ronald Reagan.
Was Roger dumb enough to put his own bank account on the letter?
No, well, I don't know. But it wasn't his bank account, and at this point, the police didn't have any hard evidence to pin the Tylenol murders on Roger. He was charged with misdemeanor weapons violations for the guns they found, released on bond, and that was it. But naturally, investigators traced the account in the letter, which led them to a man named Frederick Miller McCahey, heir to the Miller brewing fortune. But Frederick wasn't the culprit either. He had no motive and, frankly, wasn't stupid enough to use his own bank account in an extortion plot. When questioned though, Frederick did point to someone who might have a vendetta against him: Robert Richardson. But that's when a critical clue surfaced. A Kansas City police sergeant was sitting at home watching CBS Evening News when a picture of Richardson was put on screen and he nearly fell off his couch. Why? He recognized him, but not as Robert Richardson. He knew him as James Lewis, a man with a shady resume to say the least. This sergeant, along with 2 detectives, hopped on a plane to Chicago, brought their knowledge to the Tylenol task force, and officially connected the dots. Robert Richardson and James Lewis were one and the same. Investigators began running a thorough background check on Lewis, uncovering some gruesome facts. His first run-in with the law occurred 4 years before the Tylenol murders, when he was suspected of killing and dismembering Raymond West, a man for whom Lewis had worked as an accountant. Despite the suspicion, he walked free due to insufficient evidence. Then, in 1981, he was convicted of mail fraud in a dubious credit card scheme. A man with such a history naturally became a prime suspect. At the height of the investigation, the police launched a nationwide manhunt for Lewis. All departments were placed on high alert, as finding him could be the breakthrough everyone was desperate for. So now they had a name, a face, and one big problem: finding him. The extortion letter had been mailed from New York, so the FBI narrowed their search there. Federal agents painstakingly combing through neighborhoods, checking transient hotels where Lewis and his wife Leanne might be hiding. Meanwhile, Lewis couldn't resist the spotlight. He started writing letters to the Chicago Tribune, criticizing their coverage and correlating details about himself. Oh, and he signed these letters Robert Richardson because if you're trying to keep a low profile, why not send letters to a major newspaper? But here's the genius part. These letters gave the FBI a clue. Lewis was clearly following newspapers' coverage closely. That meant he needed access to newspapers. And where do you get those in Manhattan if you're hiding? Libraries and newsstands. So, the FBI flooded libraries with wanted posters and kept an eye on newsstands. Weeks passed, the trail went cold, and then, BAM! Mid-December, a librarian spots a clean-shaven man she's seen before. He's hunched over a reference book about major newspaper addresses. Something clicks, and she calls the FBI. Agents race to the library, charge up to the 4th floor, and there he is. James Lewis in the flesh. He doesn't resist, doesn't try to run. He just stands up and lets them cuff him. Once in custody, Lewis firmly denied any involvement in the poisonings. Authorities failed to find any direct evidence tying him to the murders. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and, as DNA testing was not standard at the time, no way to link him to the crime. But here's where it gets interesting. While Lewis adamantly denied being the killer, he offered to help the police piece together the puzzle.
How would he be able to help them without being the one who did it?
Exactly. At the time, the police still had no leads, just loosely formed theories about how the tampering might have occurred. James Lewis stepped in with his own ideas, claiming he could help. During the investigation, he created detailed charts and diagrams outlining how someone could have tampered with capsules and returned them to store shelves undetected. Over the years, Lewis met with investigators multiple times, sometimes in hotels or restaurants. And these weren't casual conversations. They were highly detailed, often unnervingly so. He laid out elaborate methods the killer might have used, ideas so meticulous they bordered on the uncanny. For instance, Lewis speculated that someone could open a Tylenol bottle without leaving fingerprints by using nylon or cooking gloves. He also described how a paperclip could be used to open a capsule without leaving any visible marks. To drive the point home, he demonstrated how cyanide could be inserted into capsules and the capsules reassembled in under a minute, even right there in a store aisle.
That's eerie.
It gets eerier. Lewis created detailed sketches of devices, like a drilled board method. Picture this, a piece of plywood with holes to hold capsules upright. The killer could scrape cyanide across the tops and recap them seamlessly. His creativity was unsettling, to say the least. His detailed letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the killings ultimately earned him a conviction for extortion. He served time in prison for that, but was never charged with the actual murders.
Oh, come on, how was he not the guy?
Well, Lewis claimed he couldn't have been the Tylenol killer because he wasn't even in Chicago when the murders occurred. He insisted he and his wife, Leanne, had moved to New York months earlier, in July 1982. According to him, they were living in Manhattan at the time of the poisonings in late September and early October. No fingerprints on the bottles, no hard evidence tying him directly to the tampering, and without any of that, all they had were his bizarre speculations and circumstantial evidence, like the fact that his fingerprints were found on a book titled Handbook of Poisonings when his home was raided. He painted himself as a guy who just happened to get involved because of the extortion letter. However, there were a few other persons of interest, and one of them was none other than Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Back in the early 1980s, when the Tylenol case was dominating headlines, the FBI was hunting multiple domestic terrorists, including the Unabomber.
The Unabomber? How'd they tie him to the murders?
It started with the death of Jay Mitchell, a 19-year-old Sheridan College student who died unexpectedly on July 26, 1982 in Wyoming, before the Tylenol poisonings rocked Chicago. But unlike Tylenol, he had consumed Sudafed, another OTC medicine. He had purchased it from a local store to relieve cold symptoms, but his death was also determined to be the result of cyanide poisoning. Kaczynski's name came up due to his past use of cyanide in booby traps and mail bombs, his general targeting of strangers, and his pattern of sowing random chaos. His history and proximity to certain areas put him under the spotlight. Kaczynski, as some of you may know, was mailing explosive packages to universities, airlines, and anyone he felt embodied the evils of modern technology. His crimes and the Tylenol poisonings shared a few eerie similarities that raised eyebrows. For starters, both used ordinary everyday items, bottles of Tylenol and mailed packages, as their weapons, adding a psychological element to their crimes. But what really piqued investigators' interest were the geographical overlaps. Kaczynski grew up in Chicago and had ties to the area during the time of the Tylenol murders. Also, Sheridan, Wyoming, where Jay Mitchell was killed, was on the way if Kaczynski was traveling to Chicago from his cabin in Montana. Kaczynski had been known to test out new methods before executing his full plans. Could the Unabomber have been experimenting with cyanide in Wyoming before going to Chicago and committing the Tylenol murders? It wasn't impossible. But despite these connections, the FBI eventually ruled out Kaczynski as the Tylenol killer. His motives, while similarly chaotic, didn't align perfectly. Kaczynski's targets were carefully chosen, symbols of technological progress or individuals tied to his manifesto's grievances. The Tylenol poisonings, on the other hand, were disturbingly random, with no apparent ideological bent.
So, it wasn't the crazy chemist guy, the extortion letter guy, or the Unabomber?
Not conclusively. Some even speculated it could have been a disgruntled Johnson & Johnson employee. such as someone inside the company angry enough at their employers to sabotage their own product. But that theory didn't hold much weight since the poisonings occurred after the bottles left the factory. Another theory? Random terrorism. Back in the early 80s, there was growing fear of lone wolf actors striking without warning. Some investigators believed it could have been someone looking to cause mass panic, with no specific target beyond creating chaos. But none of these theories panned out. No clear motive, no definitive trail to follow.
But come on, the Lewis guy, he described the crime in detail and wrote an extortion letter. And you're telling me that none of that ties him to the crime?
Investigators had hoped it would. If they could prove Lewis wrote the letter before the murders began, it would be game over. But Lewis's timeline didn't add up, at least not conclusively. He was cagey, his memory foggy. One day he'd swear he wrote the letters after the murders. Another day, he'd contradict himself. Frustrating doesn't even begin to describe it.
But come on, do you think he did it?
Honestly, he's the most compelling suspect. But without hard evidence, it's just speculation. What's certain is that he enjoyed the attention. He even created an artwork titled Tylenol Suspect for Life. Not exactly subtle.
So what, that's it? No one solved it?
Unfortunately, no. The Tylenol murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved cases in history. But the tragedy did lead to significant changes. Tamper-proof packaging became the norm, and the pharmaceutical industry overhauled its safety protocols. Those annoying seals on medicine bottles? You can thank this case for them.
Alright, fine. The annoying seals on Tylenol are actually really cool, and I'm glad that I don't have to be worried about being poisoned with cyanide. Happy?
Yes. Wow. Thank you, Grill, for having such a well-informed opinion.
You're welcome.
And thank you for sticking around till the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing to our channel. It's the best thing you can do to help us keep making more videos. Like this one, about the woman who found human body parts in her chili at Wendy's and the chilling truth behind it.